Hello, and welcome to Voice the SASHA PoSHcast, your go-to podcast for all things posh. This is your host, Shweta Bhatt, and the theme for this month is PoSH for Transgender Employees. Now, this episode is a two-parter, and this is part 2. In part 1, we looked at the definition of who a transgender person is, the context as to why it is important to talk about them and their rights, what the law has to say about them, and I spoke to Aparna Mittal on trans inclusion, becoming effective allies, and organizational changes in policies. In part 2, I speak to Vikramaditya Sahai, who works at the Center for Law and Policy Research. They live and love in Delhi, and they can be found at Viquerum on Twitter. Vikramaditya and I go on a deep dive on topics like the intersectionality of gender identity and caste, affirmative action, comprehensive sex education for children, and other points of change. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Vikramaditya, thank you so much for agreeing to be on this podcast and for sitting down with me for this conversation. This is going to be a very enlightening, I'm sure, a very insightful conversation. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Thanks for the performance pressure.
No pressure at all. No pressure at all. I'm really looking forward to learn here. So, Vikramaditya, we have a list of questions. Our team in SASHA and as well as the community, the larger community. So, I'm just going to run you through the questions, and you can answer them one by one.
Right. Sure.
All right. So, the first question that we have gotten is, what is the difference between sexuality, gender, and sex? And how many genders there are? And this is a very common question that people either ask directly or more often allude to. And it's I think it's very important awareness to have. So what do you say about that?
I think the question really has no one answer, because all of these things are contingent on historical developments that it's very difficult to say that this is this or this is that. And the only way in which I can kind of answer this kind of question is by looking at them as compartmentalizing falsely some of these answers, right? Because in one way, the kind of academic distinction is not necessarily, or the academic or the feminist distinction is not necessarily how people interact with each other. And so often, without even this vocabulary of gender, sex, sexuality, and so on, people do have relations that one could define as them. So then one really has to kind of figure that naming is a very particular kind of epistemic process, and often is a kind of violence on relation, and also that even as it may recognize and illuminate some of that violence. So I do want to add that as a qualifier. So let's actually just think about them in terms of one important document that we all have some allegiance to. Again, a document that emerges in people's life differently at different times, and perhaps even unconsciously, which is the Constitution of the country. Now, in the Constitution of the country, when we think about categories of discrimination, it is there that we hear the category of sex, right? So say article, the right to equality is one in which you will finally have that people that prohibits discrimination on grounds of race, creed, place of birth, caste, and sex. And so, in fact, if you look at the earliest kind of legal precedents for conversations about equality, etc., under Article of 14, 15, and so on and so forth, what you find is that the law is trying to maintain equality before law, and often the when the category of sex is deployed in legal judgments, etc., it is to maintain an equality which is generally assumed to be a kind of sameness, that men and women, because in these cases it's mostly men and women have an equal right to the same things. So I one of the cases I investigate in one of my quote unquote academic papers is a case where a man has filed for um, a case under the law, uh, arguing that as a man he is not being promoted to the position of a senior nurse, since that position was assumed to be only available to women. Eventually, they win the case. And what the court therefore kind of works with is this kind of idea that these barriers shouldn't exist, and neither should these kinds of stereotypes. And why I take this case is because even though it may be one case, it kind of illuminates that at that point the conversation was actually about equality as sameness rather than kind of seeing this as a field of power. And thereafter, in the last decade, what we have seen with the Supreme Court has been that the category of sex has been enlarged to include gender and sexuality. In the Navte Johar judgment, which is a judgment that decriminalized consensual sodomy under Article 377, Section 377, what you have is that the court had to interpret the category of sex as now holding the category of sexuality. That was the only way in which a constitutional bench could do what it did, because there is no mention of the word sexuality, right, in the constitution. On the other hand, in the Nalsa versus Union of India judgment that quote unquote recognized the third gender, the Supreme Court had to recognize gender under the category of sex. And often it took precedent from judgments like the one I've just mentioned, because one of the things that the Nalsa judgment says is that people should not be held prison to stereotypes and so on and so forth. So trans persons are seen to be can be read under the category of sex, right?
So, so the question that we have gotten is to do with with affirmative action and
right.
the many perspectives around that, and it is again a very hot button topic, a very complex topic. But I want to ask you: do you think all workplaces should be mandatorily having a certain percentage of transgender employees? What could be the consequences, the ramifications of this, and how might organizations, if so, go about implementing them? What do you have to say about this?
So the question of reservations, I think it really is a question of what people imagine equality to be. So I will kind of leave that kind of larger answer. Maybe some of it will be answered in what I say. I'm always I think we have a lot to learn from the anti-caste movement about reservations. And one of the things that often the Dalit movement and the anti-caste movement say very clearly is that the opposition to reservations does not actually come from some fundamental belief in equality, but actually entitlement. That is, that without reservations, people feel like they are entitled to the seat. Otherwise, what is your protest against a seat or a position as taking away your place in the world if you do not actually fundamentally believe that that was your place in the world, right? Now, none of these people have particularly people who come out on the streets against reservations have been guaranteed those seats, right? But they believe that because they are Savarna, that it is their right to be in IAS officer, to be in schools and universities, and to have these positions of prestige and so on and so forth, right? Without that prior sense of entitlement to these positions, there is no ground to say things like our seats are being taken, because they're not their seats. They are public seats that are made available to everyone. So, on the one hand, they assume that they are everyone and that we constantly think and say things like general as against reserved, um, rather than saying unreserved, right? Because Savarna people do actually believe that they are general, they are the universal, they are everyone, and that all the people who are taking uh, some aid of reservation or support are not everyone, right? So, so I think the question has to be that without reservation, who who would these seats go to? And the answer is everyone, which begins it will go to Savarna folks. So, without reservations, it is not possible for historically oppressed communities and presently oppressed communities. We think of historically oppressed as if it's like caste was a thing of the past. As it would not be possible for people to be in universities, be in positions of any kind of prestige and respect, and so on and so forth, right? So, so the caste division of laborers would continue. Um, and if one sees the fact that trans people mostly do sex work and begging, it is also a kind of caste division of labor. It's, I mean, I even the Badhai Toli is a form of, it's a economic transaction for sure. It might seem more equitable, but I would kind of put it within the rubric of begging, because there's no imagination that these are wages. So if sex work and begging is literally the only options for uh, for uh, for non-Savarna trans folks, then there is no which they would make it to any workplace without it, right? So even say, for example, um, like even if, for example, you think about the kinds of positions that have recently been made available to trans persons via government uh, action or policy, you would see that they're all positions of none of those are managerial positions or supervisory positions. They're mostly metro train employee, warden of prison, security staff, and so on and so forth, right? Um, because it is almost unthinkable that you would hire trans persons at any position of even minuscule power, right? So I actually see that as the continuation of the keeping out of trans persons as a continuation of caste practices. And so therefore, reservations for me are the only way in which a equal world is actually possible. Um, and an equal world, and what does an equal world mean? Does an equal world just happen, or does an equal world need to be made, right? And And I think a world is I mean world not in terms of this kind of planetary kind of imagination. I mean world in terms of just our relation with each other, right? Because that's the world for most of us. Most of us do not transact in this language. The world, when non English speakers in the quote unquote cow belt say desh, they don't necessarily mean this thing called India. They just mean back home, right?
Yeah.
So then for me, if you are actually committed to equality, then one has to think about reservations and affirmative action as part and parcel of that vision. And sometimes much democracy is imposed on this country. I remember Dr. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly said it's a kind of strange moment when you have political equality for everyone, but not social equality, right? Uh, if caste was to continue, then we would simply not have democracy, and we don't, insofar as we see caste patriarchy continue. So, what is the notion of what is the notion of equality and freedom that we have at heart? Is it merely procedural, or is it a kind of substantive conception, which might involve, and this is really important, the upliftment of the powerless is impossible without the stealing of power from the powerful. Everyone cannot be made powerful. That's simply not possible. So the powerful have to be, in some sense, robbed of their power, looted, stolen, whatever, because the power gives them that sense of entitlement, and they think of power as their property, which is why I'm using words like theft and looting. So if you actually do believe, and it is impossible to not believe that Savarnas do believe that it is that they have a right to this power, without actually violating that right, you can actually have any conception of equality and freedom. So then reservations for me should be compulsory, as the right to equality is compulsory, right? It is simply within, for me, a facet of the fundamental right rather than some kind of mere policy. And maybe that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, it does. So even when it comes to workplaces, organizations, and as you said, it's a very interesting thing in terms of, for me, it was very insightful to hear about how when when we use words like general category, and I had not thought about it that way.
That's so I just have to bark that that's thanks to Professor Satish Deshpande, who's written about this very
Fantastic.
and of course the large anti-caste movement. But I know that when I name an upper caste person saying this, then your viewers will also go and read him. So
Now, coming specifically to like companies, if companies were to be, and more companies are now looking at being more inclusive. So, in order to, this is something that I've had organizations ask me. We at SASHA, people have asked us, how is it that organizations can go about being more trans inclusive, as in terms of recruitment, in terms of policy, maintaining like a safe environment for organizations, for work, for their employees, etc. What do you of course it's a huge topic, but if there is one or two things that organizations can begin the journey with, what would you recommend?
okay, I'm going to begin with the most kind of radical thing first. Because if I
Okay.
say only a few things, then I'll say the most radical one first,
Okay.
which is that all organizations should stop sabotaging workers' associations and unions. Without a union, it is simply impossible for any worker to have any substantive conception of right, and feel supported in any struggle that they might undertake, or any resistance that they might want to kind of perform against backlash or alienation or oppression and so on and so forth. The reason why people suffer silently is not because they want to be silent about it, but because um speech is not a one person action. Speech requires a community.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, for me to speak up about what my problems are, I need to feel supported by a community. And often, the language we arrive at of hurt, injury, wounding, trouble, oppression, etc., are collective languages. Pain, in particular, is one of those things of which there is, as Elaine's study shows us, that you often do not actually have the vocabulary for pain. You can only say, I feel pain here, but you can never really describe pain. And often, pain, therefore, means this kind of communication of the incommunicable that people pick up. People know what pain feels like. And therefore, the pain is actually uh, shared only insofar as it is communicated. And without and it can only be communicated insofar as it is shared. So therefore, what we have is that when we say when we say that trans persons need protection at the workplace, the first protection that they need is from the individualism of companies that are obsessed with competition, with individual merit, with people outshining each other, with pitting people who are equally powerless against each other, and so on and so forth, right? For small pieces of breadcrumbs, really. So then that's the first kind of thing, that we need a collective conception, um, a kind of common conception of what we are and who we are as workers, rather than a kind of individualized conception of hurt and injury. That's one. The second is the ambit. What is the ambit of our fundamental rights within private bodies? So far as private corporations and bodies have so much leeway to devise policies, you know that anti-discrimination law is basically applies currently only to public offices and public bodies. So the private corporation does not even like actually can be held accountable to discrimination, right? And even though the private body is actually a discriminatory space, like studies by Dalit scholars like Thorat, etc., have shown that even when you send resumes that look completely alike each other, if the person looks, if one of the names is Savarna and the other is a non-Savarna name, then the Savarna person is called to the interview. It's just the nature of things. And I use this because it almost seems natural. Like it's not even a in one mind. If one was asked this question, it's often that the name just sounds familiar, etc. And so people have taken not very conscious practices of discrimination and prejudice. So if that is the field in which we're operating, the larger question is actually what is the to what rights and sense of obligation to even something like the constitution can a private body be held, right?
Yeah.
So then, without actually having proviso for anti-discrimination policies, anti-discrimination committees in offices, really have nothing that will protect any member of this private body, right? So the second thing, and even though I think this is the least radical thing that I will say, but for me most important, is the organization of committees within offices, and so on, that have some sense of autonomy in order to address discrimination in the office. We know that the Committee Against Sexual Harassment has been particularly targeted and made into a kind of semi-criminal body, uh, rather than the kind of body that was about changing workplace ethics and practices, right?
Mm.
And without such a body in place, both in the private unit that might be the office, but also a place where you can take these bodies to court, like say the district magistrate's office, where currently all the ICCs are for organizations that are less than 20 people and so on and so forth. That you you have without this, no person would feel protected.
Mm.
Um, and thirdly, and I'll say this, that the present prison industrial complex, which includes the police and which includes the courts as they function now, are fundamentally about injustice rather than justice, because the largest cases of under trials, the largest number of inmates, the largest people on death penalty, etc., all happen to be from oppressed communities, because the system favors Savarna upper class people. It is not the place for, and so it seems like I'm contradicting, but I can explain that maybe later, that it is almost impossible that the way in which the legal/justice system actually exists, that any person can actually be protected against discrimination. That actually the very people who would be the ones coming with cases of discrimination, their communities are the ones that will most likely be penalized and incarcerated by the very system.
Mm.
I'll stop there maybe.
Yeah. It almost seems like a very impenetrable, huge block of, there's so much work to be done, is I guess
Yeah.
I want to say. So actually, one of the questions that has to do with, when we talk about, for example, individually mindset wise change, and we always
Right.
it in terms of like starting young. So from children, what do we teach children? And
Right.
the question of comprehensive sexuality education, for example,
Right.
uh, how woefully lacking it is currently. So
Right.
questions that has come to us is about covering sexuality education in a much more comprehensive manner, and hopefully from there on, in terms of, at least in terms of awareness, in terms of individuals taking responsibility, there might be changes. So what do you feel are the gaps that need to be addressed here?
Okay. So I'm currently working with the NCRT,
Ooh, okay.
trans persons in teacher training modules and so on and so forth. So this conversation for me is very detailed. But I will say a bunch of more broad brushstroke things, and maybe then one can have a more pinpointed
Yes.
conversation. So I think so I've been in education for a bit now. I've been a teacher uh, for some time. Um, like for most of this decade, I have been teaching. The last decade, and so in my capacity as a teacher, I know that education holds a lot of promise, but it's also one of the greatest sites for the perpetuation of inequality. Um, and often it has to do very simply with the relation between teachers and students. Um, and insofar as our teachers constantly come from the same cloud of oppressors, then it is very difficult for education, no matter how radical, to hold any sway. Um, so lots of oppressed communities will tell you that, I had a Savarna professor teaching me about democracy, and the hypocrisy of it all is just so apparent that no matter what the textbook holds, uh, it simply does not translate. And in fact, one is just becomes deeply cynical and so on and so forth, right? So many of our professors carry their right-wing ideologies into the classroom. So much of schooling is about and a patriarchy being made ethical, right? Being an obedient son or daughter, uh, uh, being a good student is to be subservient to the power of the teacher, and so on and so forth. So I think the we have to, and of course horizontally, students, young people are particularly mean and nasty. If you've been in a classroom where you haven't been the stud and the jock and the beauty queen, who comes from a rich background and so on and so forth, your experience of school is anything but one of an education. Um, so you have teachers who practice inequality by favoring students and so on and so forth, to students who bully and are often violent. So the school is anything but some place where a utopic imagination can actually be drawn from.
Yeah.
Secondly, it has to do with the fact that when we imagine young people, we imagine that we have to train them into the simplest of things. I once dated a, a a person who's a mathematician, and they told me that this the mathematics that we learn in school is not actually mathematics, and that when you come to your undergrad, you have to unlearn everything that was taught to you in school in mathematics. Um, Algebra is not what it looks like. Geometry is not what it looks like. Why 1 plus 1 is 2 is not that obvious. Um, and so often what we do is that for sake of our own imagination of young people as simple and naive, we offer them ridiculous understandings of the world, um, that actually life will make them unlearn. So often, actually, in the last decade, all I've had to do is actually unlearn so much of, like, what I had been, while I'm still unlearning. Actually, the process of, like, after education, the process has been actually of unlearning rather than learning. Uh, because without, like I said, without actually emptying the powerful, you cannot make room for the powerless, right? Uh, so for example, we I taught a course. I used to teach at the gender studies faculty at Ambedkar University, and for the first time, we were offered an option when I was there to teach undergrad students. Um, and the idea was, oh, we will. Often the unsaid injunction was to make it simple and so on, because these were students, 17-year-olds, right out of school, first semester undergraduate students. My colleague and I decided that we will offer them an MA course. That is, we took one of our MA courses and we changed some of the readings around, but we offered them the conversation the conversation on gender sexuality that we were offering to students who were doing their masters, and it was a success. We didn't have to strip down conversation. We didn't have to make things simple, etc. In fact, they could very well hold the breadth and depth of all conversations that we were offering. And in fact, some of them did much better than a lot of my master's students. We don't have to teach people simple things in order for them to later learn complex things. If the world is complex, then you have to offer the complexity to your students. And part of education should be the ability to grapple with complexity rather than deny it and defer it. So, for me, fundamentally, dealing with young people is to stop taking them as simple, naive, and innocent, but to take them as corrupt, mean, and nasty, and offer them the complexity of the world that exists, in which their nastiness is part of that complexity, right? So that would be so yes. The question is, of course, there should be sex education in schools, but what the question is, what does that include? And does that include learning about reproductive organs, which they will pick up from anywhere? Does that mean a deeper conversation about how love unfolds in the school and how sexuality is deeply tied to the maintenance of caste endogamy? And without actually having a conversation in schools that shy away completely from conversations about sexuality and violence, two things that are rampant in schools from kindergarten onwards. If schools are going to be built on the denial of their own violence, then we cannot have this conversation. I think we need to completely change the way in which we in schools are run and how the practice of education hitherto has existed.
Big overhaul. You know what you said reminded me of the concept of shadow selves, right? So in when we talk about the psyche of a person as to what is not allowed to be expressed or what is not witnessed in a child, let's say. So when we sort of make children to be this little humans without nastiness and without the tendency to violence, without all the negative parts that they do have, it doesn't go anywhere. It's there, but then because it is not witnessed without judgment, it it tends to, there is a festering or a rotting of it, also which then sort of as adults uh, has a huge impact on the way they think, they feel, on the way we behave and interact with other people, which ties into the larger sort of socio-cultural context. And yeah, I think it's a huge disservice that we are doing to children in terms of not considering this part of them.
Yeah, I think we're also just. I think we have a very warped imagination of what childhood is.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Um, and I think we need to kind of have more conversations about the child as separate from childhood. The child is a far more complex figure than childhood allows. And unless we actually start paying attention to the child, I think we're really kind of just basically denying very important facets that unfold in very complex ways all across life.
Yeah.
Say for example, like we have these conversations about trans children in school, and often transness is assumed to be a majority identity, as in like age of majority, like consent, like you have to be
Yeah.
age of consent and so on and so forth, like an adult identity. But so many of us had very different and almost wild imagination of our gender when we were growing up. And the routes I've taken are quite circuitous towards my own gender identity. So I'm also speaking from that idea that um, um so I really feel like we have to, in some sense, come to honest terms with the fact that the child is not the vestibule of childhood, and we therefore have to kind of really grapple with what this figure entails. And again, I have to say this, that as often what we have in our head as a child is is not the child on the street, is not the sex worker's child, is not
Mm.
a domestic worker's child. It is the figure of both child and childhood that is run in the dominant imagination, and the hegemonic cultural imagination and ethos is one that is protected, one that is uh, joyous, one that whose innocence is in some sense indefatigable and infallible. Uh,
Mm.
and that's not really the case of many of us. I grew up in a house with a mother who decided to separate from my father when I was 6 years old. There is it is I understood then and there what had happened, right? um it My mother did not have some kind of conversation, quote unquote, with me. uh,
Mm.
Sheer evidence of her crying herself to sleep was evidence enough of the deep hurt that my father had caused. So much so that at the age of 8, this happened. My mother separated at the age when I was 6. At the age of 8, I remember getting a call from my father wondering if we would like to meet and we should talk. I remember simply refusing. Uh, both from having understood the sense of hurt that he had caused my mother, but also from the peculiar form of moral righteousness that children inhabit. Um, and so children are complex figures, and without actually recognizing this complexity and historical location, and undoing some of the ways in which uh, Savarna-ness is the default position of childhood innocence,
Mm.
we will not be able to handle some of the questions that you are, and actually offer to the student or child anything useful. Uh,
Mm.
all.
Mm. Um, I think segueing to from sexuality education, segueing to the topic of discussed topic of consent and sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Just because some of the, I mean, sexual harassment as a topic itself is loaded with myths and misconceptions in all levels, and subtle. There are obvious. There are a lot of myths going around, and there are a lot of uh, preconceived notions, and also those in power. So, for example, in workplaces, employers, internal committee members hold. Um, so when it comes to the sexual harassment of transgender employees or transgender persons within
Mm.
outside of the workplace, what are some of the misconceptions that uh, you have come across, seen, experienced? Would you be able to share some of those, just for awareness sake, I guess, because the more we are aware of it, the more the invitation is to sort of uh, move past it.
Right. Um, uh, okay. Sorry to break everyone's heart. There are no transgender employees. The only transgender employees are in public offices, um, in very low paying, uh, almost exploitative work. Private company, we are yet to see trans people being hired by organizations without actually them gaining some massive diversity points. Where the hiring of one trans person who is then sent to all corporate meetings to become the face of the organization and its massive PR campaign. does not exist. So that particular trans employee, who's also the diversity face, just get like to be treated nicely. And often companies would go out of their way in order to treat them nicely. But what we're imagining is a trans working force, and that is yet to exist in this country. Um, so the whose harassment are we actually speaking of? And I think this is kind of complicated simply uh, because of the history in which we understand sexual harassment and so on and so forth. First, the history of sexual harassment in this country is deeply tied to Savarna privilege. The very idea of the guidelines come from a case that is yet to get justice, Bhavri Devi's. The Vishakha guidelines came from Bhavri's case. The Bhavri's own case was dismissed in the Vishakha guidelines as something that they cannot handle. And we actually benefit from Bhavri's struggle, even as Bhavri continues to be in wait for justice. We see this very clearly when you say that in around the same time as Bhavri's case, about a few years later, you have Rupan Bajaj's case against KPS Gill, one of the most kind of senior, most famous civil servants in the world. And why does Rupan get justice? Rupan gets justice because she happened to be married, and she happened to be Savarna, and she happened to be someone whose honor the Indian state needed to protect as a married Savarna woman, IOS officer, right? As against the Sathin that was Bhavri. This is really about the ways in which in India sexuality is deeply tied to this thing that we call honor, right? And about a kind of a way in which sexuality continues to be used to police caste patriarchy. And I don't mean this informally. I mean this in terms of the large scale impunity for caste based violence in this country, and and the way in which atrocity cases are actually addressed, right? So even say feminists, Savarna feminists saying that the Hathras rape case was not atrocity but a rape, and we shouldn't bring caste into the angle, and so on and so forth. So we have a problem here. We have a problem in the way in which we imagine sexuality. As soon as you start imagining sexuality as a function of caste, you tend to see things differently. And this is why it's really important for me that we think about the history of sexual harassment. So insofar as society is about honor, and this is my second point, is this communities without honor will simply not be covered or protected by sexual harassment law. So say in an economy where when you show up to the police station for filing a complaint against quote unquote what is dismissed as eve teasing, the fact that your clothes are under scrutiny, the fact that your whole behavior is under scrutiny, the fact that you have to become the perfect victim in order to for the crime to even be registered. Show us the marks on the body. How did you resist? And so on and so forth. Even as we know that precisely resistance will have us killed, right? There's a greater chance that we will survive a rape by submitting to the rapist than we would by fighting it. This is basic common sense. And yet the law demands of us the evidence of our fighting. And so it would rather have us dead and honorable than undead and like raped, right? So then what we have therefore is that communities that are seen to be without honor are communities that are not protected by laws that are in place to address sexual violence. So sex workers and would be a great example, but also say trans people who are also just a large majority of them do sex work, so there's an overlap. But two, that it is in the public imagination, it is the trans person who's the harasser and not the cis person. So often, what we see amongst our in the trans community is that if when doing sex work, men will say, "Okay, we'll pay for this and this," and then they will have sex and then refuse to pay wages. They'll call the police when the trans person is doing when they're throwing a tantrum about not being paid wages, and the police will come and incarcerate the trans person for harassing the cis person, because the cis person will say, look, this trans person is harassing us, right? So in an economy where the trans person's sheer existence is seen as a threat and harassment, they speak too loudly, they clap, they are aggressive, so on and so forth, then what is the capacity of a trans person to fight for justice for sexual harassment in an economy where they are not seen as honorable, acceptable, or savarna? The third factor is that sexual harassment works when they within a heterosexual frame, because you can quote unquote legally separate gender from sexuality. But when the person is seen to be only about sexuality and sexualness, then the ability to separate their gender from their sexuality becomes impossible. So isn't all harassment against trans persons sexual harassment? So then how does the body deal with that? If all, see, because women can face other forms of harassment, because part of their body or their existence in the world can be compartmentalized into this thing called the sexual. So sexual harassment law includes any kind of gesture that might be unwelcome, a sexual gesture that might be unwelcome. But all gestures towards trans persons work with the field of sexuality as a site of violence and policing. So then all harassment against trans persons and against LGBTQ people at large becomes sexual harassment. What does the capacity of a body that addresses sexual harassment look like? And my final point, that the law against sexual harassment is a law that is supposed to address not sexuality, but the workplace. It is so bizarre now that we think that sexual harassment laws against sexual harassment are supposed to bring consensual sexual relations between men and women. Whereas, going back to the history of the case that began all of this in Bhavri Devi, etc., it is the lack of protection and women feeling unsafe at work, and that the workplace becomes a hostile space for them. That was the problem. The problem wasn't sexuality. The problem was the workplace. Yet, our bodies have become disciplining bodies about sexuality and sexual conduct rather than addressing the inequality at the workplace. And so, if sexual harassment bodies do not have any capacity to address workplaces and bring about changes in workplace culture and so on and so forth, rather than sexual culture, we are basically left with a moralizing body rather than an effective one. And I think without actually thinking about the workplace as the problem, we are basically leaving trans persons under a deeply moralizing and disciplining impulse that will ask us to wear full sleeve blouses and proper saris to work, rather than and cross our legs and so on and so forth, rather than, and or maybe at best offer us a paid vacation, rather than actually address the systemic and structural inequality that the workplace perpetuates and is complicit in.
It has been unlike any previous episode that I've recorded in this podcast series, and in a very, very good, very enlightening way. Thank you so much.
So performance anxiety worked.
It did, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So just, is there anything that you would like to say in closing?
Oh my God, the emphasis on final words.
No pressure again.
No, it's not a pressure, because I actually, in my life, I've been, as someone who's always grieving the loss of my grandmother. I'm always thinking about final words. You know, one of the things that my grandmother was very sick before she passed away. And we had to spend long hours in the hospital, and we were being pulled at edges. I was, especially because we aren't actually as a family financially very stable. So she was in a private nursing home, and it was getting very expensive. And it's also the peculiar frustrations that you have with a sick person, and you start blaming them for their sickness. And I remember at one point, she needed to get up at night. I pulled her hand too hard. And the next day she told my brother that, I was her favorite grandson. But the next day she told my brother that, uh, you stay back. I don't want this one to stay. And it really broke my heart. And I'm yet to forgive myself for it. But I often think about the burden of last words as a peculiar burden when ends are not in our control. And it is one that actually freezes grieving and mourning rather than actually allow for it to take over us uh, and change us. So the striving for perfection that is part of conclusions and last words is one that I feel is antithetical to the world we need to grieve. So I always have a problem answering this kind of question. I would actually say is therefore that we have to let go of the individual as a site of power and agency. Everything that I have shared with you, I have learned with other people, as and by being part of movements that are larger than myself. And without actually being part of them, none of this education would have happened. This for me is very important because we actually believe that by sitting in our homes and listening to the right kind of people and reading the right kind of books, we will learn how to live in the world in a free and equal manner. Or we'll develop some practice of freedom. For me, that's actually impossible, It involves subjecting oneself to the intrusion of the other, that one learns the practice of freedom without actually being open to this stranger who is not our friend, our family, our community, and so on and so forth, but one that is interested in a practice of freedom with us, that we will arrive somewhere. Which is why, for me, in some sense, the migrant or the refugee is really the figure of democracy. Without actually, because democracy has to be open to someone not in their place. It is precisely caste that asks us to stay in place. So one of the things that I have to, in some sense, emphasize is that if we are actually fundamentally committed to democracy, then we have to be open to radical otherness. And it's precisely the ways in which we have been socialized that we will close any possibility of otherness entering our universe. So if we continue to go to school, go to college, get married, have 2 children and a dog and a cat, and live in the suburbs, there's no way in which democracy would even touch us. So it is actually only with the practice of working in a collective, and a collective that has some emphasis on reservation, that we can actually move towards a democratic practice.
Thank you. That actually summed up our conversation.
Yeah, I tried doing that.
Yeah. And it summed up the red thread of our conversation very, very well. Thank you for that.
Welcome.
Now-
Thanks, Shweta.
And that was part 2, dear viewers. I learned a lot in this enlightening episode and the conversations with Aparna and Vikramaditya. Thank you to both of you. What, dear viewers, are you left with? What questions do you have? What do you think about the episode and about the topic? Do write to us at voice@sashaindia.com. We would love to hear from you. Do also follow us on social media for further updates on our upcoming events, podcasts and videos. Until next time, this is your host Shweta Bhatt signing off. Take care, stay healthy, and remember, to prevent and to protect is to progress.